Well, Valeria Pinero, my colleague and co-author of the report, will present this. I'd like to give the floor to Valeria for her to indicate what is going to happen. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. And would like to thank you for being here with us today. It's a very important day for us here because this is the first time we're having this special global event on the food policy and global food policy, but particularly from the perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean. First, I'd like to give you a general overview of the report that has been prepared, both from a global point of view, and then I'll give it to my colleague to look at this from the Latin American Caribbean point of view, and we'll have comments from the panelists on the report, and particularly what they think about the future and what will happen with the recommendations in the future. Having said that, I would like to say again that I'd like to ask for the slide. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank John McDermott because we prepared this presentation together, and to the translation for the other meetings with other regions and for the report in general. Now, IFPRI produces a report annually, but for this year, 2021, the emphasis obviously is on COVID-19 and the effect of the pandemic. In the report, we have analyzed a number of issues, of course, and everything related to COVID. Next slide. So I'd like to start off emphasizing what happened in the first year since the beginning of COVID-19. As we can see on the left, there is an indication of confirmed deaths because of COVID-19, confirmed, from the beginning until February 2021, and the major impact in Europe and North America, but they're very different indications depending on the evolution of the pandemic and the effects in Latin America. Then on the right, you can see the GDP effects indicating differences, regional differences. Latin America is the most affected with a 7% economic contraction, whereas in the rest of the world, it's just over 3%. Next slide. This pandemic has indicated the close link between health, food, and the economy, and the diversity of the policies applied in each country. And we've seen the effects of the restrictions on movement and the various other elements compared with 2019. And we will be covering all of these points future in the presentations. Now, the first three things. First of all, it's important to analyze the trade-offs between health, food systems, and economic targets or goals. Secondly, there's a recognition of the interaction of the effect of health, economic, and social policies. And finally, we want to develop processes for coordination between policies to work in various sectors and disciplines. Next slide. Looking at regional differences, here we can see that the lockdown and movement restrictions in the different regions that varied depending on the country, and also the indication of government support and the extent of government support, and finally the reaction, for instance, digital, the role of digital activities on the borders and how things could change with the use of digitalization. And then looking at agriculture, the effect on agriculture, and also the highlighting inefficiencies and inequalities in the system, in the food system. And here, next slide. Serious challenges in the global food system for health and other aspects, sustainability, and so on. However, we had responses, policy responses that highlighted the inequalities and weaknesses in the food systems. And in different regions of the world, there was differences between rural and urban communities and the various populations. And then the second point is some systems have been more resilient than others, some sectors, depending on structure, governance, and the role of the public and private sectors. Here, I would like to emphasize the importance of the transformation of agriculture based on the 5 objectives and the 5 goals, which are the 5 chapters of the report: resilience, nutrition, inclusiveness, sustainability, efficiency, and health. And so we can go on to the next slide. So let's start with resilience. Policymakers should look at the trade-offs between the policies and health priorities, the food system and the economy. With the pandemic, we saw that there needed to be speedy planning policies, which were applied with greater efficiency. They were more successful than in other countries. We had systems of information and on the programs, and these were determinants in the success of the policies applied for the development of programs for the poor and the vulnerable, focusing on nutrition and education, among others, and health, and with the importance of a speedy implementation. And also the stimulus for private initiatives and the development of medium and small and medium enterprises, or rather their support. Moving on to next slide, going to nutrition. 3 million people cannot be do not have the necessary nutrition, and this is based on 2020 to 2022, and looking at the population of the world, there was we needed government measures to contain the pandemic, and this is recommendations based on helping to support those who needed to improve the quality of their diet and to have healthy foods. And there was an impact on demand and also on the need for high calorie density foods. And also need to look at specific development, social development programs, looking at the effectiveness of foods and healthy diets, particularly for various groups, including children. Next slide. Next slide. Looking at the environment, natural resources and the environment. Obviously, there had to be an increased awareness, but there was a delay in development and implementation. The first action would be sustainable environmental policies for food systems, and secondly, the lack of focus on the environmental elements would weaken the impact. So there are 2 recommendations. First is to generate the evidence and capacity to integrate sustainable environmental programs in the food systems and positive for nature. And in multiple focuses would be the second recommendation, to have the government institutions, policies, and group to technologies at appropriate levels. The next slide. Next slide. Speaking about inclusion, on the next slide, recognizing inequality and the design of policies to tackle this. We'll have to look at the effectiveness of the policies to improve life for the vulnerable populations, not only during the pandemic, but in general. So the first recommendation is to develop a better understanding of the risks and existing situations, and to have sufficient funding for the programs. The second is to adopt innovative solutions, such as digital transfers and social involvement, in order to develop work to eliminate inequalities. Next slide. Next slide. The efficiency and value chains in food, looking at the interruption of this supply food and in the system, and as well as looking at processing and the various ways to tackle this. Looking at an improvement in the food system, including inclusion of the private sector, but facilitated by the public sector, and to have development of investments and jobs in development. That's in this. A second would be to speed up innovations on the market, the reorganization of the market, and the fourth would be to improve the basic infrastructure, and finally to have government support specifically for access to the market and the development of SMEs. Next slide. And with this, we will conclude the presentation by saying that the pandemic is still here. We are still experiencing it, but I'd like to emphasize three things. It is to have the involvement of all sectors in the food system, and it's essential to prevent and better react to shocks. This will include better financing, flexible networks, competitive and effective channels, and with the development of infrastructure and improve development. Secondly, we need to have expansion and flexibility of the social protection policies, together with resilience of all the actors in the first point, but the second point will cover economic, health, and environmental. The third is to improve access to infrastructure and markets, particularly digital services for information on markets and supplies. And finally, to look for innovative means to finance the transformation of the food system, to look at the impact and public financing in relation to this. Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to give the floor now to Eugenio Diaz Bonilla, who will introduce everyone. And Eugenio, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Michael, can you put up the presentation on the screen, please? Next slide. This is a part of the document, the chapter that we prepared on Latin America. And the first point to note is that the region already had serious problems before the pandemic took place. The region has always been affected by a cycle of commodities and the per capita incomes, vitality of the democracy. But the good news is that in the 90s, we saw the advent and the advance of democracies in the last cycle. We also had, as you can see on the screen, the relationship between the average per capita, which is in blue, and the prices of the commodities and energies, and you see that a very close correlation between commodity prices and energy. And the second cycle, that is from 2000 to 2010, in the middle of the financial crisis, of 2009 rather, we saw that between 2018 to 2019, great a weakening of democracy. Not only the economy, but actually the democracy in those countries as well. In this context, which is very complicated, the pandemic took place. Government have reacted with a series of policies, health policies, and especially for lockdowns and control of activities, which was very unequal across the region. It would have been possible to have, it would be better to have employment and follow up. There was no vaccination at the time, but because of the economic impact with the food crisis on the one hand, and the problem with supply and demand, and the problem of maintaining jobs and salaries and loans and credits, etc., we see a difference in the fiscal expenditure. On the left, you can see the situation in many of the countries in the region. Some countries in Brazil had almost 20% in the impact. But there was a greater fall in other countries. And in Brazil is the only country that is above the percentage that it had before. So we see that there is a great deal of heterogeneity among the countries of the region that you can see. So in Brazil, there was a great deal of fiscal support. There was monetary support as well. But this does not figure on this. Despite the inequalities and the heterogeneous nature in the response of governments, the entire region continues to have very serious problems from the economic and health standpoints. We have 30% of 30% of global deaths of COVID-19. Of that 30%, 8% come from this region. We have a great level of recession in the Latin American countries, and the characteristics of the Latin American countries as it's characterized by high levels of urbanization, a great deal of inequality in the informal sector. We also have problems with obesity. This is one of the major problems that we have. We know that it is a factor that is a risk factor for COVID. And I've said in the previous cycle, and the problem with the commodities, the government have had to try to adopt policies to solve this. We have some simulations of the impact in 2021, 2022. We have a model that was developed by IFPRI and adjusted with, in keeping with epidemiological data. And the simulations are suggesting the same thing that we have seen in the previous data from IMF. In 2022, we would still have not gone back to the per capita income of 2019, and there'll be increased and persistent poverty and nutritional problems. We'll have to see the impact on accessibility. The FAO in its last report said that there will be major problems on diets. The simulations suggest that from the impact, there will be 16 million, more than 16 million people in Latin America in the Caribbean, who will not have access to an acceptable diet. But as you said, even with the recovery in the 2022, this will just be slightly over the numbers of people who would not have access to an acceptable diet. Because of the impact of the COVID, we have not been able to identify the major changes in prices. So we know that for other regions, there are changes, and changes have taken place next. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that what we are seeing, that we have seen a recovery in the world growth and the prices of world the prices of commodities, and which is rather different. The impact of COVID is just an aspect of what is of increasing and which is influencing the prices of commodities. There have been problems also with drought. We'd also hoped, due to the advent of the vaccination, that there would be some improvement in tourism, especially in the Latin American and Caribbean countries. On the negative side, with what we have in Latin America, and especially in the southern part, due to in winter, is a new threat of COVID. So what we have to try to do is control the pandemic through aggressive vaccination programs. And for this, we need to improve the mechanisms for collective action within the region, as well as to have a national mechanism for coordination, which would be very strong and proactive. As we have seen in Latin America, is below the world level as far as vaccination programs are concerned. Next. So one of the points that we discuss is it as with respect to food systems, that we see some similarity with the rest of the world. We have a continued problem with food security and poverty. And we have to see how to deal with the poor, the extreme poor, the new poor that are coming from the pandemic. We see an increased focus on social safety nets, especially in the agricultural sector, for example, and other sectors. We have to have a transfer, conditional cash transfers due to the increased poverty. Food systems have to be monitored to impact them, to see the impact of the pandemic on the agricultural sector. And we have to see what is also happening with the SMEs that have been affected. We have to look at the problem with debts, indebtedness. And finally, we have to improve investment and innovation. There are some countries that almost 70% of the countries in Latin America and Caribbean invest less than 1% on invest 1%, less than 1% in agriculture. We have the question of productivity, climate change, and energy saving. Now, next one. What should we do on the international level? We have two crucial moments this year. We have had the Food Systems Summit of from the United Nations, of course. So we have the Summit of the Americas. We will be discussing access to vaccination and generally the financial aspects, for example, increase in capital from multilateral development banks. We have to adjust financial policies to increase the involvement of the private sector. We have to look at a few proposals that have been presented and proposals that will have been presented in the Food Systems Summit of the United Nations. We want to have a goal of zero hunger in our countries. We want to have a monetary expansion as a response to the pandemic. Next. Now, and I conclude with this, a major point for the Latin America and the Caribbean is that the Latin America is is a major net food exporter for agricultural and food items. And it is a crucial source of environmental sustainability at the world level. So how do we manage the pandemic and to transform our food system so that they can have global impact? It is therefore fundamental that the countries of Latin America should work together on the regional level to strengthen the international system. And here I would just like to read to you a sentence from IFPRI, who was the first president, who said in 1973 in Brazil, he said that talking about this question, with the Latin American nation, we have a continued vital force. We have to ensure the culture from throughout the region, which is not, we are a whole fragmented nation. It is not a set of separate nations. We are being fragmented if we cannot work together and coordinate together and try to face the present situation. But therefore, and this is the final message that I'd like to have for the pandemic and response to the pandemic, we must work together. And we should state this in the Summit of the Americas that we'll be having this year. Thank you very much, Eugenio. I thank you very much for stressing the importance of Latin America in the role as a leader in global security and the responsibility that we have as far as the environment is concerned. You've also stressed the importance of having cooperation and coordination. And with having said this, therefore, we'd like to have the comments of the panelists. And before I give the floor to Manuel Otero, you can see the curriculum of all of the presenters in the web page for today's event. And the careers of these panelists have been outstanding. And I'd just like to start at this point with Manuel Otero, who is the Director General of ICA, who is the International Institute, Inter-American Institute for Agriculture, Cooperation Agriculture.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Valeria and Eugenia for the presentation of the report. And I'd like to say that we've had almost a decade of this impact, but this is a profound crisis and recession that we have. And agriculture has been a sort of driving force as a sort of buffer since 2019. The food exports of Latin America and the Caribbean increased by almost 3%, whereas there was a fall of more than 9% in investments or in the inputs. So this meant that there were very difficult situations, and this was to try to feed the over 1 billion inhabitants in the Americas. So the first year of COVID, the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean responded with very focused policies, focused on short marketing circuits, family farms, the most vulnerable populations. The attempt was to try to make sure that the food supply chain would not be interrupted. However, we've looked at major challenges, and as has been said in the presentations, we have to look to the future because the pandemic is ongoing. And we have to look at the problem of a severe fall in GDP and restrictions. And we have to look at there's been an increase in food prices, and the food chain cannot just stop. Apart from the health crisis, and there's an environmental crisis, on top of that, there would be a food crisis. And so agriculture and rural development is of significant importance on the global vision. But so we are fully devoted to heeding the call of the United Nations to fight against future food scarcity and problems by focusing on the SDGs. But what we don't agree with is that some sectors and some views say that food systems have to be revamped practically from scratch. And we're seeing a profound transformation in food systems in Latin America, but they're saying that this will have to be done from scratch in order to achieve economic sustainability and development. Now, there are some facts that cannot be denied. Over the past 30 years, food systems increased levels in productivity, employment, and above all, we are the leading net exporter in the world. Our region is. So in the future, as both have said, obviously the food and agriculture sector in Latin America has to continue producing safe and good food, but we have to look at the nutritional content of the food, but we have to promote a system which is non-negotiable for food and the environment, and continue focusing on a high value marketing. And here, the importance of trade. And I think for the time being, not enough emphasis is placed on this. There's a new border between science and technology, or a new horizon, which allows us to be more sustainable and more innovative, to allow us to close the major gaps in the region because of the fall in value and of serious problems of drought and so on and waste, but because we have an exemplary set of natural resources, but we have to use them in a rational manner. So in order to transform food systems, we need a new investment policy agenda, and we need to encourage more creativity, innovation, and development, investment in development to facilitate this. We're trying to participate very actively in the process of summits. The Secretary General launched the appeal in December 2019, and we're in the round of fora, and all sorts of dialogues, and we're focusing on digital agriculture and regional dialogues. For instance, the last meeting that was held on the 4th of May with important values established for the region. We're also undertaking other hemispherical or dialogues in the hemisphere with various organizations, trying to make sure that our positions will converge and that ICA, through the various institutional events, be a sort of sounding board for the focus, innovative focus on agriculture in the continent, involving the main participants as well, to make sure that this can be achieved. I think I will leave it at this. And thank you very much for having given me the opportunity to speak. I know I've gone over my time. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Otero, for those comments and for sharing the Latin American view in relation to food system transformation. And now I'd like to give the floor to Victor Manuel Villalobos, who's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development of Mexico. Good afternoon, Mr. Villalobos, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valeria. Good morning. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you. And thank you to IFPRI for giving me the opportunity to take place in this to take part in this dialogue and share some experiences on the impact of the pandemic, as well as regional work within the Latin American Caribbean region to deal with the consequences of the pandemic and to ensure food system security and food security in the systems of our country. This meeting is an opportunity for us to, and here I'd like to thank IFPRI for its support, to look at the road that must be followed for the future, the immediate and the long-term future of the sector. Thank you very much, Valeria. Thank you so much, Eugenia, for this invitation, which has allowed us to understand the reality. There's no doubt that the crisis, that is a pandemic, has had unprecedented effects on human life, and the scope of its economic, social, environmental repercussions are still not known. At this stage of the crisis, we do recognize the role of farmers, and thanks to them, we have been able to guarantee food for entire populations. There is no doubt that they are the real saviors and have helped and led the war against this in Latin America again and the Caribbean. We have to continue to support local agriculture, direct distribution of agricultural inputs, optimization of land for cultivation, the promotion of innovation, and access to credit to allow us to guarantee survival for the countries of region. Do we know that there is a pressing necessity to increase the productivity of cultivatable land? We cannot continue to be faced with agricultural problems. We have to ensure that our farmers are protected by multidimensional policies that will increase resilience and ensure the responsible use of natural resources. Especially, this should be the focus of our attention, that is water and agricultural land. In Latin America and the Caribbean, which is one of the regions which has already been stated by other panelists, it is one of the regions with the greatest potential for being a net exporter of food, producing to a large percentage of world trade. We therefore have great capacity to successfully deal the process of transformation of food systems that are already underway, and which I think that it's a system that is irreversible. I therefore think that it is important for us to, at this stage, to lead a crusade of interaction and coordination amongst the countries, between the countries and these organs and bodies that will allow us to have access to food for all. We have to dignify the work of the fishermen, fisher folk, the livestock raisers and farmers throughout the region. We know that we have been having dialogues between the ministers of agriculture, and we have concluded that agriculture must continue to be and will continue to have a fundamental role in global recovery from the pandemic. Therefore, we must join all of our efforts to ensure that we strengthen the central and strategic role of agriculture of agriculture as a supplier of food, quality, and in necessary quantities as needed by our societies. We have to mention some of the actions that I think that must be undertaken and developed within the region to achieve this end. Firstly, we must guarantee that stabilize access to food, as well as ensuring continuity of food supply chains for the most vulnerable populations. And secondly, we must strengthen the policies and capacities of the government, so to invest in the post-pandemic recovery and to ensure that we can evaluate the different policies so that we can focus and increase value chains. Thirdly, we have to increase social protection and social safety nets against disruptions so that you can deal with the adverse effects of the pandemic and build links between protection, social protection, and the rural areas. We also have to increase and help the most vulnerable people and ensure gender equality. The increase and improvement of food systems requires investments, study and dedication, and association and joint action. We must therefore modify the way, change the way which we produce. We must also improve governance so that we can have a balance between the interests of all of the stakeholders involved in agri-food systems. In this context then, IFPRI, with its mission, plays a preponderant role in bringing about solutions in research in order to reduce in a sustainable manner and putting an end to hunger and malnutrition in developing countries. Region and national programs and international programs should be in keeping with the needs for investment and should also help the countries to solve their food problems so that they can function for all in a sustainable way. And this should be a part of its institutional strategy. I would like to convey my congratulations to IFPRI on its report, on the global report on that we have just been talking about. And we know that 2020 was an unprecedented year in many respects for the developed as well as the developing countries. So the pandemic has brought a whole series of problems to health, the economy, and as also severe disruptions in global movement of persons. We do agree that developing countries and middle-income countries have seen many countries, many more people coming into a situation of vulnerability and falling into poverty. And we have seen problems to access to health service and adequate nutrition. Particularly, they look at the potential long-term effects due to the pandemic on livelihoods and the fall in resources and incomes, and this has been particularly severe. And this has already been said. We think, especially at the time, we cannot see an end to this pandemic for many countries. We know that the pandemic has underlined the inequalities and weaknesses in our food systems. In the agricultural sector, we must design long-term public policies in order to boost the transformation of our food systems, which will make them able to solve the question of vulnerability that has been laid bare by this pandemic, including strengthening of the social fabric and increasing and improving nutrition for our populations and having social policies and systems. It is extremely important that we increase production and that we support in this effort the small, medium, and large enterprises, as well as the producers, the farmers in the agricultural sector. Finally, investment and research and innovation in this sector are necessary so that we can continue to increase and improve food systems and food chains, food supply chains. Latin America and the Caribbean will continue to play a central role as far as food supplies is concerned to all the rest of the world. We can therefore successfully transform our systems and consequently have an impact at the global level. I'd like to once more to thank IFPRI for allowing me to talk on this forum and with so many wonderful friends. And I hope that we can be hearing other analyses from other speakers in this. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much for that presentation and speaking about investment and understanding the incentives for all those involved in the primary agricultural, others in the food sector. And of course, not losing sight of the most vulnerable groups. With that, I'd like to give the floor to Alejandro Velez, Vice President of the Association of Colombian Farmers. Thank you very much, Alejandro. You have the floor. Well, thank you very much, Valeria. I'm quite very pleased at the summary of the report. I think you've touched on the main points, but I'm going to look a bit more closely at Colombia in this context and share our perspective from the beginning of the pandemic. In 2020, we see the effects of the pandemic on the productive sector in Colombia. It was perhaps even, you're saying it was positive, no, even though our economy was falling, the 6 or 7%, but it prevented a greater fall. But it wasn't so much because of public policy. It was a matter of circumstances and conditions. We had already finished the first part of the crop cultivation, sowing in the year, and so we were ready to harvest. when the pandemic started. So it, as in the rest of Latin America and Caribbean, we gave priority to food supplies, which was logical because there was a pandemic. But we had support for the areas that were under cultivation, and we had long cycle crops. But they didn't. It didn't have that much of an effect on the various areas. So we had a very clear situation. Now, your report has focused on some of these, but the sectors have reacted in a somewhat different way. Let's say it's a bit of a sort of cup half full in our sector. Let me explain. In 2020, we had growth in a way. We began to see two things, though, that were a threat, and two things that were opportunities. And the report looks very closely at the price of commodities, very good. But there was something that wasn't perhaps fully taken into account. And it was, the pandemic triggered panic in a lot of people. And the prices of soya rose to the highest in history. $120 per ton in international markets or more. Corn, also maize, reached exorbitant levels. And countries such as ours, which produce these crops as part of our main crops in agriculture, meant that there was an impact with the rise of rising prices. But then the pandemic started to affect us badly, and not so much in 2020, but we think that by the year 2022, that's when we're really going to feel it. And why? Because it's not so much its production. There's a series of things happening throughout the world, social impact, and the world is speeding up in food production. And but perhaps we could inject it in a sector that is more to make it more productive, various sectors. But the problem is the fall in income among people, and that is tragic. In 2020, with direct aid, we were able to help people. People were helped with food. There were a number of subsidies that were given to people but this was to slow down demand in a way. We felt that the fall in demand for rice in Colombia because of the pandemic is 12.5% approximately. That's a fall in demand. But on the other hand, we had an increase in prices. So here's where the sectors have to change their view, their vision, and look. We are a major exporting sector. We can be. That is our bridge. Not just look at Colombia, but look outwards and be able to use this. That would help us to consolidate the situation and create solidarity as well. And from that point of view, that's how I see it. But I think where the problem lies is with demand. That's our greatest fear. Just to tell you what's happening in my country today, there's a social sort of development on one hand, but the impact, to sum up the effects of COVID on the country, if there's any risk, it's the fall in demand. As far as prices are concerned, we haven't seen this as a major problem. What we've seen, on the contrary, is that at the end of last year, strangely, there was a slight decrease in prices because of logistics having developed and marketing and so on. But now the prices are still, well, for our population, I have to say this, the prices are still rising. So what we have to do is focus on sustaining the population, all those families that no longer eat 3 meals a day. We want to make sure that they are able to eat properly in the future. And this is one of the first problems in the rural areas particularly. And then secondly, public policy measures. This is the moment countries such as Colombia, and I won't mention my neighbors because we have very similar problems and others, but how are we going to, based on the pandemic, overcome some weaknesses in the productive structure? Because Colombia is the greatest importer in Latin America of certain products. Well, corn and soya. We buy 6 to 7 million tons of soya, but and from leading producers such as Mexico. But then what happens? This is the right time now to establish programs to improve the situation, to offset the weaknesses, as has been said by others, Victor Manuel, to focus on the trade policy. Those of us who have tremendous economic resources have injected money in because this has been what's been happening, as Valeria has mentioned. But what have we been doing with the investments? We felt that the best way is to use a credit instruments and to make loan conditions more flexible. Because by using loans, credits, we can minimize the exceptional spending and keep people at work. And this will help them to develop their productive activities. So looking at this from a Colombian point of view and making abstraction of the very difficult conditions in the country at the moment, what we're seeing is that we need the Latin American coordination, but among the activities that are coordinated, we should see this as an excellent opportunity to give greater support to the productive sector and to adding value. I'd like, other than that, to thank IFPRI very much for the quality of all the work that has been done in the report and all the comments made. But we hope that this will have an impact on public policy makers in terms of enhancing the resources and to make sure that we can turn this situation of COVID into an opportunity to develop our rural agriculture and our agricultural structures, because we have the capacity to do so like other countries do. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alejandro, for your comments, particularly emphasizing the importance of the entrepreneurial vision as well, looking at not just prices, but also looking at the importance of investment. It's very important, as you're saying, through credits, through lend, that it's important to have easy access to loans. That's very important. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to Ana Maria Ibanez, main economic advisor of the Vice Presidency of Sectors and Knowledge of the Inter-American Development Bank. Ana Maria, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria, and thank you to Eugenio and Valeria for inviting me to take part in today's panel. I'd also like to greet all of the fellow panelists. I would just like to congratulate you for this wonderful, important, and pertinent report. It has so many of the recommendations that we know that we'll start discussing. As Eugenio said, this region has been particularly hard hit by the pandemic in terms of deaths, and we have 80% of the population affected by this, and 30% of deaths. 8% of people are contaminated. I would just like to point to a point that is mentioned in the report, that it's a question of resilience and the importance of preparing the region for greater resilience in the face of future shocks. In the report, it is said that there are 3 dimensions. The first, the prevention of shocks in order to avoid and to soften the impacts, and the reduction of shocks and helping the countries to manage shocks and absorbing the shocks in order to mitigate them once these happen. This prevention, absorption, and anticipation are essential not only to manage future pandemics, but also to deal with those that are caused by climate change. And these are the types of shocks that I'd like to concentrate and talk on it, talking about rather than the present conditions. In particular, we need to concentrate on extreme situations. We see a drop in production and the failure of some strategies to deal with these impacts. The question of migration, as you're all aware, is and we know that climate change can increase migration since it exacerbates the trap of poverty, and we see a deterioration of the environment. And this is very aptly brought out in the report. In a preliminary article that we have been seeing is that we look at to see whether rural households in El Salvador have used migration to mitigate problems in agriculture and their subsequent loss of incomes. So we have seen that the short term, the loss of agricultural possibilities in the face of a shock has meant that the larger agricultural firms sometimes substitute farmers, and livelihoods are affected, and therefore farmers have to migrate to compensate for the loss of income. In El Salvador and countries in this central areas, there are some regions that I would like to mention. Firstly, we have a high percentage of poverty that is due to the loss of agricultural production. And we see a situation that happens a lot in many countries of the region. We see that a large number of agricultural producers are subsistence farmers with very small with 1 or 2 hectares in expansion. So that, of course, it's very important for these farmers to ensure that they can manage risk in the face of shocks. Thirdly, agricultural production depends to a great extent on rains. For example, in El Salvador, only 1.1% of the lands are irrigated. And of course, we have climatic events such as droughts that has increased over the last few years. We see that there were 3 prolonged droughts that had devastating consequences for agricultural production. In the drought of 2012, the coffee production fell by 70%. So if we look at this, see that increases in climatic shocks have led to greater migration in El Salvador and other countries, and the impact of this is great. Have the shock of the temperature shocks increases by a few degrees, for example. This increases the migration of agricultural households by a fourth. And what we see that the drop in agriculture is severely impacted. And there is a loss in harvest per hectares. And this has very strong impacts on prices. And price increases, agricultural farmers try to compensate with doing other types of work, informal work. So many people try to migrate to urban centers of the United States, for example, from farmers from El Salvador. We see that once migration is a strategy that households can resort to in dealing with shocks, external shocks, and we see increase in people looking for stable incomes. And if we provide stable incomes to farmers, this can decrease the level of migration. And we can actually do this by having access to financial markets, but having the adoption of technologies that we can improve productivity. For example, in the IDB, we are promoting technological programs that are sustainable and trying to ensure complementarity with programs of social expansion. So what we're trying to do is more than it's research and development that was already mentioned. Research and development are very important to increase resilience and to have technologies that they can be used by the farmers to deal with these types of strategies that are resorted to by people who use migration to deal with external shocks. It is very important to have follow-up and monitoring on it. And having said this, I'd just like to conclude by thanking you so much for inviting me and congratulating you on your wonderful report. Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. I think that the points here, it's points that have been repeated by most of the panelists today. Having said this, I would like to give the floor, open the floor to questions and answers with the audience. You may have put your questions in the chat, and all of those who are participating, please place your questions in the chat and we will try to respond to them. So I would just like to start with Secretary Villalobos. What should be the questions of greatest interest and concern to the countries of Latin America and Caribbean, especially as we go to the Food Systems Summit as well as the Summit of the Americas? I think that the most important thing is that in the region, we must ensure that we have an agriculture which is based on three fundamental pillars. That is firstly the improving and increasing productivity, ensuring that we are more efficient in production, because of course there are a large number of technologies that will allow us to increase and expand productivity. And everything that can be done to achieve this aim must indeed be done. We must be more inclusive in our approach to agriculture. All farmers, all agricultural producers are important. We must have a differentiated policy so that we can consider the needs of each sector of that group or this subsector. In Mexico, we have different types of agriculture. For example, some highly technologically sophisticated agriculture. Also, we have subsistence agriculture. I insist that they're all important and necessary, but they have different needs. So an inclusive policy is fundamental to recognize the needs and to have policies that are particularly designed to deal with the needs. Another point, fundamental points, should be to have a more sustainable agriculture. There are households that need to be far more responsible and giving. We must have programs that will allow people to have greater access to water. We must take all of these resources available, the soil, the lands available. So we must have a much more responsible vision to reply to and respond to the needs. So these visions must be supported by us as a country and as institutions. When we talk about food without agriculture, without producers, is a mistake. I do not know any food debate or discussion which does not go first through agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Villalobos. Now, for Mr. Otero, considering the impact of the on the financial finances of the government, and how can we develop research and development needed for the transformation of the food system in the Latin America and the Caribbean? Well, thank you very much for the question. I think the question has already been touched on by Eugenio. I think we all agree we have to reinforce national science and technology systems and infrastructure. Unfortunately, taking a closer look, there's some problems that have to be improved on. Low levels of investment. I think Eugenio said less than $1 for every $100 of production in agriculture, whereas in developed countries it's almost $3. And there are many problems, gaps. The differences between Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile. Well, there's quite a high level of investment in those countries in science and technology, but that is not the same in the other countries. In many cases, in fact, resources are used for urgent matters, for health crises, health matters. So the research programs don't really exist on a long-term basis. Now, the agendas, the programs based on the green sort of motivation, green energy, crops and so on, less than 10% in livestock raising and dairy, and looking at more sustainable livestock for production maybe. And then there's the environmental impact. ICA places a tremendous importance on the dynamism of the economy, and we're focusing on certain rural areas, and we've realized that researching renewable energies and bioplastics and biofertilizers and biopharmaceuticals, these are all sectors which have very high yields on investments. So we've been looking at these. And finally, just to say this, we need the public-private partnership to be able to really tackle and reverse the situation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that answer. Now, for Ana Maria, I'd like to ask you, what sort of development strategy do you think would be useful for Central American countries? And what about climate change plus efforts for the pandemic? You mentioned some examples in your presentation, and you mentioned irrigation. What about the importance of irrigation in El Salvador? Why is there so much investment there for that? To see if you could add to the answers given to the two questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's an important question. And I think I'd like to put it in the context of the development of these countries, as you've mentioned. First of all, is you have countries such as El Salvador, which depends to a great extent on agriculture, and it also depends on this for income for the poorest. So it is important to develop the region with productive public goods to help to tackle risks and provide all the tools to be able to raise agricultural productivity, not only among the small farmers, but also the larger farmers. This is essential. So irrigation, for example, is essential for productivity to be increased. However, there's something else which is critical. This region is extremely vulnerable in terms of climate change. Climate shocks are increasingly intense and dangerous. So we have to have a region that's going to be viable in some regions for farm, but there are other areas that are not viable for farming. And we have to see, how can we help those regions? How can we help them to become economically viable, not necessarily in terms of farming and agriculture? So I think how do we prevent immigration? And when agriculture becomes viable, then we can prevent this migratory flow, the migration. If we can have help the areas that are viable to become better, or when they're not viable, look for other additional alternatives for production. And this is something that we need to discuss for the entire region of Central America. Thank you. That was talking about migration. Thank you very much. Alejandro, I'd like to ask you, what is your view of the situation this year? The main difficulties, you've spoken about Colombia, but the chains in terms of wholesalers, retailers, and uh, uh, looking at the overall, you looked at the farmer, but what about the rest of the food chain? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria. Firstly, I'd just like to say two things. I think that the first thing that we have to do in any country in the region is to establish a priority on what we're going to work. Of course, everything is important. There's nothing more important than others. There are countries, of course, that establish a priority. They attack one thing first and then they attack the others. If we attack everything at once, we're not going to be able to have much success. So, of course, as human beings, we want to have a response immediately, but of course, we have to envisage a solution first. And this brings me to a question: what happened to food chains, food supply chains on the internal level? What have we seen? Well, we have seen that one, there has been isolation, that we think that with what has happened so far, there is countries that is deficient in vaccinations, for example. What has happened? We see that there is a major problem that, as Ana Maria Ibanez was saying, there are many very small farmers, but there are many, many people who have to go out day by day to work, to earn a living. So there is a level of a large number of people who are affected. So we have to countries to see who are the people who are mostly affected. So what happens as far as food is concerned? And this is a question that I'm throwing out. The example of coffee was a wonderful example. We had with coffee, when coffee, the production went down, of course, there were not enough people selling. So what happened to all the livelihoods of all those countries? And the livelihood of those small farmers and those poor people. So practically, they have fallen to, poverty has gone to a level that is almost unprecedented. So what happened? People could not go to a restaurant and they therefore had to cook at home. Of course, the question of food is very important. The question is very valuable and valid. So in developed countries, the concerns are very different, whether you cancel your subscription to or buy a newspaper. But in a poor country, it's different. The concerns are different. To go back to the normality, the normal situation that we had before, and is to have a level of food supply. So I think what we need to do is to see how we can guarantee this continuation of the food supply chain. Of course, major restaurants tried to make menus to distribute to people. But what I think is important that we have to guarantee is food supply. And how do we do this? We have to look at this because the pandemic has had a major impact. The major impact has been on isolation of people. People cannot go out to look for food or couldn't go out to earn a living. So we have to see how are we going to avoid new such great disruptions that will distort the food supply chain? And this is a question that, as I said, and that is still, it's still not yet been sufficiently dealing. There's still a number of uncertainties we have to see, because we are a region that are net exporters of agriculture or agricultural products, and where the flows of supply, so when supply flows are very badly affected. Whenever this happens, our region are the first to be affected, to be adversely affected. But I think that we have to work to see how Latin America is going to consolidate our efforts, how we are going to maintain levels, acceptable levels. We have countries, for example, we have to see how we can consolidate these networks and these flows of a trade in food products. If we do not work on this, when we have very impacts from other disruptions, we will enter into major problems. We'll have problems with exports, and we'll have other types of problems.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Now, we have had a lot of comments and questions on funding, financing, investments, and access to loans, etc. So I would like to give the floor to Eugenio, as he has been working in the Food Summit, in the scientific group of the Food Summit this year. So, Eugenio, could you comment on these matters, please? Thank you very much, Valeria. Yes, well, IFPRI is part of the financial network group of the Food Summit. And we're also in the scientific group for discussing funding. Within the Global Food Policy Report, there's a very short chapter on how to fund the transformation of the food systems and agricultural systems. Now, we've identified 6 sources and so 6 funds flows. First of all is what consumers contribute by buying foods. $7-8 trillion at a world level. 14-16% of GDP, depending on how it's measured. So that's the counterpart. The sales throughout the entire food system, from the small farmer in Honduras to Walmart. These are money flows. There's a whole series of policies that can be converged in relation to the funding from the food system, and how there are two. There's another block which is taxes and so on, internal to the whole system, and then there are 3 or 4 external to the food system, but that help to fund the food system. International funds, for example, and development funds, and the multilateral systems, and the bilateral agencies as well. So all of them there are in a block. There's a number of measures, and there's going to be some 60 billion from the IMF issued, and if you have 2% of 13 billion to set up a guarantee fund, allowing those countries interested in developing a campaign to eliminate hunger, and that's then we have a proposal to support the countries separately, but this could generate 15 to 20 times the value of the 13 million to guarantee the issuing of the bonds, the zero hunger bonds, and some could be green bonds, but also to recover bonds to recover from the pandemic. And then looking at it from the multilateral funds point of view in a very creative way. Then the second block obviously is public expenditure. This is perhaps the most important source of funds for the food system and the social fund. You have the agricultural sector particular, but also social assistance, social support for the vulnerable groups. And what we've been looking at is, as Anna Marie was saying, for those farmers who are very small with less than 1 hectare in land, how to provide the cash funds for the social inclusion. This is what it's being called by the bank, the World Bank, and so on. So to have the various components of the social inclusion package would include the food, the nutrition, etc., and investment for the farming. So we'd have that also the banking system for investments specifically. How can the central banks help to develop the developing that will contribute to development? So there could be discounts granted, the relationship between the agricultural banks and the central banks. At that time, there were inflation problems with the central banks and the various other public intermediaries. So we're thinking of a mechanism which is more fine-tuned that would help to renew the central development banks and the way in which they operate. Such as the central banks in the United States and Europe are doing. So by about 2030, this is the aim, to incorporate all of these new mechanisms. So we'll also working on a proposal for the private sector. We're working with Manuel and ICA on the idea of a facility for the preparation of projects, a sort of incubation project for public-private partnership projects. And that would also take into account the environmental and social dimensions. Thank you very much. Eugenio, we have only 2 minutes left, but I'd like to ask if Minister Villalobos would like to comment on this dimension of the government input under the government dimension. Yes, of course. I would like to pick up on a couple of points that have been made by the previous speakers. First of all, we have to focus on the food systems. That's priority attention, and this is the only guarantee that we will have to be able to maintain, sustain food security for the region. That is by maintaining, sustaining the systems. Secondly, we need to be reasonable in, of course, looking at our biodiversity, we are very well endowed, but we have to protect it and use it in an appropriate manner. And finally, climate change, which is an urgent matter, and thanks to the biodiversity that exists, we can be much more resilient. We will be able to counter the impacts of all of the climate changes on it, unexpected impacts in the future. We have to develop a strong long-term food safety systems, linking in with biodiversity and helping us to be resilient in relation to climate change. So those are my main comments to end. And thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much, Minister Villalobos. And now I'd like to move on to Dr. Otero to see if he has a last message for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. I would just like once again to stress the fact that there is much at stake at the summit on the transformation of food systems. We want to have a Latin America that is present, especially if it's farmers. I would like to stress that it is laudable to think about the health of the consumers. And of course, I do totally agree with this. But for this, we need a rural area that is dynamic and also helpful with agriculture that has reasonable levels of profitability. If not, this crisis will come back again, and there will probably be problems to social problems, problems to agricultural lands, and was said, and to lead to migration. So we have to look at the rural sector. We have to look at it as an area of progress and opportunities and dynamism. Of course, we have to build bridges with the urban centers. And once more, thank you so much for the opportunity. I feel very honored to this, and I would like to congratulate you on your report that you have put out. Thank you so much, Dr. Otero. I'd just like to ask for last comments from Anna Maria. Thank you. I would just like to reiterate my thanks to Mr. Otero and Secretary Villalobos for thinking about these next steps. COVID has shown us our strengths as well as our weaknesses, and the importance in the future of looking at possibility of climate change. And as a region, we have to go forward. We have to look at how we will deal with the upcoming challenges. Of course, the region has quite a few advantages. Alejandro? Yes, my last comment is that first, I think that the report is a very good one. It has brought up a few very important themes. And secondly, I think that independent of the list of priorities of each of us will have, I think it is important that we should look to have policies that are centered less on the differences, but more on the points of convergence and prioritizing the what we have in common and the steps to be followed. I think that this is the important step that we have to take. I just like to throw out an appeal to IFPRI, EEC, and all of these entities. I think that their work is extremely important, and it is important for us to have real prioritization in the themes. This will allow us to act more effectively. Thank you so much once more to Valeria for this invitation. I think this has been extremely interesting exercise. Thank you. I'd just like to go back to Felipe Herrera. He always said the idea of Latin American nation is not a fragmented or fictitious entity. As I said before, he stressed the fact that it is not a set of nations. It is one nation that has been fragmented. We are not, if we do not start working together, we'll not come out of this pandemic or any of the problems that we have just mentioned. That is the first point. Secondly, with respect to the possibilities that we have in the Summit of the Americas, and I wrote a blog asking to think about an alliance for development. How can we have an alliance, a partnership for development? Of course, we have to do this in consultation with the region. But the region at this point is so fragmented, it is very important to have a group of people who are independent, who are knowledgeable, so that we can have a program for the summit. And this will allow us to overcome fragmentation. We cannot be a great nation of Latin America and the Caribbean as we have been encouraged to have. If we continue to fight, we'll just encounter far more difficulties. Thank you.
I'd like to emphasize two things that we've been hearing today. First of all, there's an increasing relationship between health, food, and the economy throughout the pandemic. Secondly, the challenge of the region to continue to being the exporter of the foods to maintain the economic, social, and environmental sustainability and economic sustainability. I'd like to thank all the panelists. It has indeed been an honor to have you all here. And IFPRI we'll always continue to thank you and work with you. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks to everyone.